There is a particular kind of question that deserves a long answer, and the young woman sitting across from me this April morning has just asked it without knowing that is what she has done. She is a reporter for the Mankato Free Press. She has a notebook and a pencil, and the patient expression of someone who has learned to wait for old men to organize their thoughts. Her name is Miss Veld, and her editor has sent her to write a series about the people who built this town. She has already spoken with the banker, she tells me, and with the widow of the first school teacher, and with a man who laid the original plank road along Front Street in 1867. Now she is speaking with me, Einar Solvang, carpenter, retired, 71 years old, and in possession of more opinions about timber joinery than any person in Blue Earth County requires. She has asked what structure I am most proud of building in 35 years of work. I look out the window for a moment. The river is visible from here, the ice long gone, the cottonwoods putting out their first green. Mankato in spring looks exactly as it should. Settled, solid. A town that knows what it is. It wasn't something I built, I tell her. She looks up from her notebook. The structure I think about most, I say, is 18 feet of earthen tunnel on a hillside 2 miles outside of town. It has been standing since 1878. I examined it myself 10 years ago, and the timber lining was as sound as the day it was fitted. A woman built it alone in 4 weeks with a mattock and a spade, and knowledge she had absorbed at a kitchen table over 17 years of marriage. Miss Veld is writing this down. Her name was Marta Kellner, I say, and I think you should know her story before you finish your series, because most of what this town is proud of, the plank road, the schoolhouse, the brick storefronts on 2nd Street, those things required money and labor and planning, and the cooperation of men who had all three. What Marta built required none of that. What she built required only memory, and the willingness to trust what she remembered. I fold my hands on the table. I'll start where it begins, I say, which is not with Marta. It is with the problem. Every family that settled in southern Minnesota in those years faced the same arithmetic in October. Wood was not scarce. The river country had timber, oak and maple, and white birch along the ridge lines, pine on the higher ground, enough wood within 2 miles of any homestead to heat a cabin for a generation. The problem was not finding wood. The problem was making wood ready to burn. When you fell a tree and cut it into logs, those logs are carrying water. Not surface water from rain or snow, water in the wood itself, drawn up through the grain over years of growth and still sitting there when the tree comes down. A fresh-cut log of white birch can be more than half water by weight, sometimes more. That water has to leave before the wood will burn efficiently, before it will burn at all, really, in the way that produces useful heat, rather than smoke and frustration, and a fire that seems to consume itself without warming anything. The process of removing that moisture is called seasoning, and the conventional method was simple enough to describe and difficult enough to accomplish. You stacked the wood outdoors, off the ground, under some kind of cover if you had it, and you waited. 6 months was the minimum before wood became reliably burnable. 12 months was better. The wood sat in moving air, moisture evaporated slowly, and eventually you had fuel that behaved like fuel. The difficulty in Minnesota was that the climate undermined the process at every step. Rain re-wetted the pile. Snow re-wetted the pile. Freeze-thaw cycles through October and November did something worse than re-wetting. They damaged the wood itself, the moisture inside the fibers expanding when it froze and contracting when it thawed, stressing the grain in ways you could not see but could measure in the fireplace, in the sputtering and smoking and disappointing heat of wood that had been damaged by its own water freezing inside it. Most families dealt with this the way most families dealt with most frontier problems, by doing more of what they already knew. They cut enormous quantities of wood in summer. They built larger covered wood piles. They accepted that a portion of their winter fuel would burn badly and compensated by burning more of it. It was wasteful, and it was expensive, and it was, as far as anyone in Mankato was aware, the only available approach. I knew this as well as anyone. I had been a carpenter in this county since 1869, and I had bought and burned a great deal of partially seasoned firewood in that time. I accepted it as a condition of the place, the way you accepted mud season in April and black flies in June. It was simply what winter in Minnesota required. I was wrong about that. But I did not know I was wrong until the winter of 1879, and I did not understand the full measure of how wrong I was until a morning in the first week of February of that year, when I stood in 18 feet of earthen tunnel and held a log that had been underground since September. But I am getting ahead of the story. I knew Jonas Kellner the way you know a man you respect without knowing well, by the quality of his work and the character of his conversation when you happen to find yourselves at the same counter at Gerhardt's store or in neighboring pews at the Lutheran Church. He had come from Moravia, from the eastern part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a region of forested hills called the Jeseniki. His family had been forest wardens there for 3 generations, men who managed timber on behalf of a small estate, who knew trees the way a veterinarian knows horses, not from books, but from years of close attention to living things that would tell you what they needed if you knew how to ask. Jonas had translated himself into a sawmill worker when he reached Minnesota, because the sawmill paid 3 times what forest management paid on the American frontier in 1865, and he was a practical man with a practical wife and the ordinary ambitions of an immigrant who has traveled a long distance to make something of himself. He was good at the mill. He was careful and experienced with timber, and he had strong hands. A forester's hands, I always thought, thicker through the palm than a mill worker's, with a way of testing a plank's grain by feel that I recognized as knowledge rather than habit. He died in August of 1877. I will not describe the accident in any detail, because the details are not the point, and because Marta Kellner lived with those details for the rest of her life without needing me to repeat them here. What matters is the aftermath. The mill owner came to the cabin 2 days later with $23 and an expression that mixed genuine condolence with the discomfort of a man performing an obligation he found inadequate to the occasion. Marta thanked him. She owed $11 to the general store. She had 40 acres of land with a roof that needed work and a woodpile that was a third of the size it needed to be for the coming winter. She had 37 years of her life remaining to her, though neither she nor anyone else knew that yet. She was 47 years old. She had been in this country for 16 years. She had built a life here alongside Jonas, not a large life, not a wealthy one, but a solid one, the kind of life that requires 2 people working in the same direction for a long time to construct. Now she was building it alone. I repaired her roof 3 weeks after Jonas died. She fed me dinner for the work, and we spoke very little, which suited us both. She was not a woman who spoke to fill silence, and I was not a man who required her to. I noticed that evening that she moved through her cabin with the efficiency of someone who has stopped spending energy on things that do not matter. Grief does that to some people. It did that to Marta. What I did not notice, what I would not understand until nearly 2 years later, was that she was already listening to something, some interior conversation that had no resolution yet, but was running steadily and without interruption underneath everything else she did. She was trying to remember what Jonas had told her about a tunnel. Her first winter alone was instructive in the way that failures are instructive when you are paying attention and cannot afford to repeat them. She had prepared as well as she could. She had cut and stacked what she calculated was enough wood for a Minnesota winter, and covered the pile with canvas and trusted the system that everyone around her was using. The first heavy snow came in the 3rd week of October. It settled on the canvas and sat there for 4 days before she could shift it, and in those 4 days the weight pressed the cover against the wood, and the melt crept in at the edges and re-wetted the top third of the pile. The freeze-thaw cycle took the rest of October to work on what remained, By November she was burning wood that smoked heavily and produced heat in a sullen, reluctant way, like a fire that resented being a fire. She fed it twice what she had planned because half of what she fed it went into evaporating moisture before any warmth reached the room. I know the specific night she made her decision because she told me about it years later, and I wrote it down in the back of my carpenter's ledger, where I have always kept notes that do not belong anywhere else. February of 1878, 2 in the morning. She woke to a cold cabin. The fire had burned down to coals that the wet wood would not revive quickly, and lay in her bed doing arithmetic. She had enough wood remaining to reach April if her consumption stayed constant. Her consumption was not staying constant. The winter was not staying constant. She lay in the dark and thought about Jonas, not about losing him. That thinking happened in its own time and could not be directed or hurried. She thought about him specifically, deliberately, about his voice when he talked about timber, about the way he would sit after dinner in the winter months and explain things that she had half listened to because she was mending or thinking about the morning's work, and because there was something pleasant about the cadence of his explanations that did not require her full attention to be comforting. He had talked about a tunnel. He had talked about it more than once. She was certain of that much. The hills in Moravia, the foresters who had used the system for generations, the way a slope could drive air through a contained space without any mechanical assistance, using nothing more than the temperature difference between one end and the other. She was not certain she remembered all of it correctly. She was certain she remembered enough to try. She spent that spring and summer thinking, and part of her thinking, the observational part, the part Jonas would have recognized, she spent on the hillside behind her cabin. The hill was glacial till, the kind of ground that nobody wanted for farming because you could not predict what you would find 2 feet down. Clay 1 yard, sand the next, a stone the size of a wash basin where you least expected one. The slope ran roughly north to south, the lower end facing south toward the open field, the upper end facing north into the shade of the ridge. It was steep enough to be useless for cultivation, and gentle enough that a tunnel bored into it at an upward angle would be stable if the timbering was done correctly. She tested the hillside before she touched a shovel. In late August, she made 2 small wooden boxes with gaps between the slats and buried them at different positions on the slope, one near the base, facing south, and one higher up in the shaded north-facing portion. She checked them every 3 days. The lower box dried measurably faster than the upper one. The temperature differential was real and consistent and could be observed in the moisture content of a piece of wood rather than in any instrument she did not own. On a still morning with no surface wind, she carried a bundle of green leaves to the base of the slope and set it smoldering. She stood back and watched the smoke. It drifted uphill, not because the wind was pushing it. There was no wind that morning. It drifted uphill because the ground above it was cooler than the ground below, and warm air, even the slight warmth of sun on a south-facing slope in August, rises toward cool air with a patience and consistency that requires no assistance from anyone. Jonas had told her that. She had been washing dishes. She remembered it exactly. She went to the barn and found the mattock, and she checked the edge, and she brought it back and set it against the fence post near the base of the slope. She would begin in the morning. It was the 1st of August, 1878, 1 year to the day since Jonas had died. She did not know if that was intentional. When I asked her about it years later, she was quiet for a moment. "It seemed like the right day to start," she said. Miss Velde has refilled her pencil twice. She is a thorough note-taker, which I appreciate. There is nothing more discouraging than telling a long story to someone who is only writing down the parts they already expected to hear. I should say something about what I knew at this point in the story, which is to say, nothing. I was a carpenter with a full order book in the autumn of 1878, building a grain storage addition for a farm on the east side of the river and spending my evenings drawing plans for a smokehouse commission I would start in spring. I drove past Marta Kellner's property twice that October. I saw a woman working on a hillside. I assumed she was clearing brush. I want to be honest about that. It will matter later. What Marta understood about the tunnel, what she had assembled from 17 years of listening, was not a blueprint. Jonas had never drawn a blueprint. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who explained things by explaining why they worked. And the why was what Marta had carried, intact and precise, through a year of grief and one failed winter and a morning in August when she watched smoke drift uphill on a still day. The why was this: a tunnel bored into a hillside at an upward angle with an opening at the lower end and a vent at the upper end will move air continuously from entrance to exit without any mechanical assistance whatsoever. It will do this because the ground maintains a constant temperature, in Minnesota, roughly 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season. And that constant temperature creates a difference between the air inside the tunnel and the air outside it. In summer, the tunnel air is cooler than the outside air. In winter, the tunnel air is warmer than the outside air. The differential reverses with the seasons. The airflow does not. Cool air and warm air move in relation to each other with a consistency that does not require a fan or a bellows or anyone's attention. It simply requires the right geometry. The geometry was what Jonas had been specific about, and it was the geometry that Marta spent 3 weeks in late August and early September working out against the actual conditions of her actual hillside. This required ruling things out. The north-facing slope above the creek, which she had initially considered because it was steeper and would have been easier to bore into, she walked away from after 2 days of observation. The problem was not the steepness, the problem was the shade. A tunnel entrance that received no direct sun would have no solar warming at the lower opening, which meant no temperature differential between entrance and vent, which meant no convection, which meant air that sat still in a closed space and accomplished nothing useful. She needed shade at the top, which the ridge provided naturally, and solar exposure at the bottom. Finding the section of hillside that offered both in the right proportion was not a matter of preference. It was the engineering problem. Everything else followed from solving it correctly. The south-facing lower slope on the main ridge gave her what she needed. She confirmed this with the buried boxes, which she had checked 9 times over 3 weeks, and which told her, with the plain evidence of wood fiber moisture content, that the temperature differential was real and consistent and sufficient. Then she picked up the mattock. I have built things with my hands for 35 years, and I have a specific respect for the mattock as an instrument of honest labor. It does not lie to you about how much work remains. Every swing tells you exactly where you are. Marta was 47 years old and weighed perhaps 130 pounds. She had spent 16 years doing the physical work of a frontier farm, hauling, splitting, digging, carrying, and she was strong in the particular way that sustained labor over many years produces, not the sharp strength of youth, but the settled, load-bearing strength of a body that has learned what it is capable of and stopped being surprised by it. She began at the base of the slope, boring horizontally into the hillside the way a mine is started, not down from the top. The tunnel would run 18 feet into the hill at a gentle upward angle, following the slope, so that the far end would sit higher than the entrance by roughly 3 feet over the full length. This angle was important. It was what Jonas had said: gentle upward slope, not steep, enough to guide the airflow without destabilizing the earth above. The first week gave her soft ground and good progress. Minnesota glacial till in its upper layers is a mixture of clay, sand, and fine gravel, and in September, before the first freeze hardened it, it cuts with something close to cooperation. She was removing approximately 30 cubic feet of earth per linear foot of tunnel, each foot of progress meaning hundreds of individual strokes with the mattock, hundreds of loads hauled out in the wooden bucket, and the small wheelbarrow Jonas had built the second year they were on the property. She shaped the cross-section as she went, Oval, 6 feet wide at the base, narrowing to 4 feet at the ceiling, 5.5 feet tall at the center line. Enough height to stand upright, enough width to roll logs through on their sides. She worked from first light until the light failed her, which in September in Minnesota gave her 12 working hours. She broke at midday for 20 minutes. She did not break for weather because the weather in September was not yet the kind that demanded accommodation. By the end of the first week, she had progressed 7 feet into the hill. On the third day, Astrid Halverson came. I should tell you about Astrid because she is easy to pass over in this story, and she should not be. She was 34 years old, a Norwegian woman who had come to Minnesota with her husband Lars in 1872. Lars Halverson had died at the same sawmill as Jonas in 1875, which is to say that Astrid had been managing her farm alone for 3 years by the time this story takes place. She had 2 children, a milk cow, and the specific competence of a woman who has had to learn, without instruction and under pressure, everything she did not already know. She and Marta were not intimate friends. They were something more practical than that, women who understood each other's circumstances without requiring explanation, who had arrived at a similar understanding of what frontier widowhood actually demanded, which was not courage in any dramatic sense, but rather the sustained willingness to do the next necessary thing regardless of how you felt about it. Astrid arrived on the 3rd morning, looked at what Marta was doing for approximately 10 minutes without speaking, went back to her farm, and returned within an hour with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. She set it on the stump by the cabin door. She did not knock. She walked back the way she had come. Marta found it at midday. She ate half of it, standing in the tunnel entrance, looking out at the hillside. That was the entirety of the assistance she received during construction. I am not saying this to make a point about the hardness of frontier life, which has been made sufficiently many times by people more eloquent than I am. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because accuracy about what one person can accomplish alone in 4 weeks with hand tools is part of what this story is actually about. The 2nd week found her at foot 9, and the geology changed. She had known it might. The glacial till of the Minnesota River country is not consistent at depth. The retreating ice that deposited it laid down whatever it was carrying, in whatever order it happened to be carrying it, without any consideration for the people who would eventually need to dig through it. Below the soft upper layers, the material becomes what geologists would later call a hard pan layer, clay compacted by the weight of centuries, embedded with stones ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a small barrel, packed together with a resistance that a mattock addresses 1 careful inch at a time. She hit a stone on the morning of the 11th day that would not move. It was roughly the shape and size of a wash basin, embedded in the wall of the tunnel at what would have been, in her original geometry, the center line of the passage. She spent 4 hours on it, not trying to break it, because you cannot break granite with a mattock, and she knew better than to try, but working around it, removing the compacted material that held it in place on 3 sides until it could be leveraged out of the wall with a length of timber and rolled to the entrance. The 4 hours cost her the center line. She had to adjust the tunnel angle slightly to the left to root around the void the stone left behind, which changed her exit point on the far wall by approximately 8 inches from where she had planned it. 8 inches mattered for the vent placement. She recalculated that evening, drawing the adjusted geometry on the back of an envelope with the stub of a pencil. The vent would still work. The angle was within the tolerance Jonas had described. It was not the tunnel she had planned. It was the tunnel the hillside was willing to give her, and she accepted the distinction without spending further energy on it. I found that envelope years later in her household ledger, where she had tucked it between the pages. The drawing was precise. Cross-section, plan view, the adjusted center line marked in a second pencil stroke beside the original. The measurements were written in Czech, in Jonas's unit of measure, which was not feet and inches, but the old Moravian system his father had used. She had converted them to feet in a second column beside each figure. She had done this work, the conversion, the recalculation, the adjustment, not because she was an engineer, but because she had listened to a man explain things at a kitchen table and she trusted what she had heard. That same week she solved the water problem, which she had anticipated and which arrived on schedule. Minor seepage appeared along the lower left wall at foot 11. Not a flow, barely a weep, but enough to tell her that the clay layer was holding groundwater at that depth and that the floor of the tunnel would accumulate moisture if she did not address it. Her solution was the material she already had in abundance. The stones and coarse gravel from the excavation, which she had been piling outside, she now sorted and used. A shallow channel, 4 inches wide and 2 inches deep, cut along the base of each wall and packed with the coarser gravel, directing whatever water entered toward the tunnel entrance, where it would drain naturally down the hillside and away from the stored wood. It was not a sophisticated drainage system. It was the right drainage system for what she was building and where she was building it, and it cost her nothing but the afternoon it took to install it. I drove past her property on a Wednesday in the middle of October. I was returning from the East Side Farm Commission, my wagon carrying a load of timber offcuts I was bringing back to the yard. She was in the side yard, measuring planks, not rough planks, finished boards, a foot wide, cut to varying lengths that seemed too short for any structural purpose I could identify from the road. I slowed the wagon without thinking about it, the way a craftsman slows when he sees material being worked. The dimensions were wrong for furniture, wrong for flooring, wrong for any interior application I could name. The lengths were inconsistent in a way that suggested they were being fitted to something with irregular dimensions rather than cut to a standard specification. I sat on the wagon seat for a moment, watching her measure and mark and set each board aside. Her movements had the quality of someone working from a mental model rather than a drawing, checking each piece against an interior image, making small corrections, moving forward. Then I clicked my tongue at the horse and drove on. I have thought about that moment many times since. I was a carpenter with 35 years of experience, and I was looking directly at the timber lining phase of an underground seasoning tunnel, and I could not identify what I was seeing. Not because the work was obscure or the materials unusual, because I had no framework for it. Nothing in my training or my experience had prepared me to recognize it. That is worth sitting with for a moment, I think. The limits of a framework. What it costs you not to know that a thing exists. Jonas Kellner knew it existed because his father had built one and shown him. His father knew because his father had done the same. The knowledge moved forward through generations of men who managed forests in the hills of Moravia, arriving finally in a carpenter's framework-free mind on a wagon road in Minnesota in October of 1878, and passing completely unrecognized. I drove home. I unloaded my timber. I drew plans for the Smokehouse Commission until the lamp oil ran low. Marta Kellner fitted her planks to the walls of the tunnel by lantern light and did not require my recognition to proceed. Miss Veld asks me if I would like more coffee. I tell her I would, and while she goes to the small stove in the corner of the office, I look out the window again at the river. There is a boy fishing from the bank below the mill, which will not produce anything at this time of year, but which is the right thing to be doing on an April morning when you are young and the ice has just gone out. I watch him for a moment. Then Miss Velda returns and sets the cup in front of me and picks up her pencil, and I go back to 1878. The third week of construction was the timber week, and it was the week that nearly undid her. Not because the work was harder than what had come before. It was harder, fitting rough-cut planks to the walls of an irregular earthen tunnel in lantern light, by feel as much as by measurement, is the kind of work that punishes imprecision at every step and rewards it with nothing. But Marta had spent 2 weeks developing a specific tolerance for the tunnel's refusal to conform to her expectations, and she brought that tolerance to the timbering with the same methodical patience she had brought to everything else. What nearly undid her was the ceiling. The walls were manageable. Vertical boards set against the earth, held in place by horizontal crossbeams notched into the walls themselves. Jonas's technique, the one I recognized later when I examined the finished tunnel and could not immediately account for why the notching looked familiar. It was old European carpentry, the kind of joinery that predates nails and does not require them, and it produced a wall lining that was structural rather than merely decorative. The crossbeams locked against the earth and held the vertical boards in compression so that the earth's own weight was working to tighten the structure rather than to collapse it. She had watched Jonas use the same principle on the fence posts along their property line. She had not known at the time that she was watching a technique. She had thought she was watching her husband fix a fence. The ceiling was different. The ceiling carried the full weight of 12 feet of earth above the far end of the tunnel, and the material available to her, white pine, rough cut, the best she could produce from the trees on the ridge with a two-man saw. She was operating as a one-woman saw, but it was not ideal for the load. She needed the planks to span the full tunnel width, bear the overburden without deflection, and be fitted tightly enough that the clay she would pack between them would stay in place rather than sifting down onto the stored wood below. She got it wrong the first time. On the 14th day of timbering, she fitted a ceiling section in the middle portion of the tunnel, the section that carried the most earth above it, and by the following morning, 2 of the planks had bowed downward by nearly an inch under the load. Not catastrophic, not immediately dangerous, but enough to tell her that the span was too wide for the material and that if she left it and moved forward, she would come back in a month to a partially collapsed ceiling and the loss of everything she had built. She removed the section and rebuilt it. The solution was not thicker timber. She did not have thicker timber, and acquiring it would cost money she had not allocated. The solution was closer spacing. She added intermediate supports, short vertical posts set between the ceiling planks and the floor, positioned at the midpoint of each span, reducing the unsupported length of each plank by half. It cost her 2 additional days and the better part of the timber she had set aside for the rack construction. The racks she rebuilt from what remained, and they were thinner than she had intended, but they were sound. I want to explain the racks, because they are the part of this system that most people do not think about when they imagine an underground seasoning tunnel, and they are the reason the system works as well as it does. Wood seasoning is not merely a matter of keeping wood dry. It is a matter of moving air across all surfaces of the wood continuously and evenly. A log lying directly on the earth floor of a tunnel will season on its top and sides and retain moisture on its bottom indefinitely. The contact surface stays damp, develops mold, and the log seasons unevenly from outside to core in a way that produces wood that burns poorly at one end and adequately at the other. Jonas had been specific about this. The racks elevated the logs 6 inches above the floor and spaced them 4 inches apart from each other so that the air moving through the tunnel from entrance to vent was moving across every surface of every log simultaneously, top, bottom, sides, ends. The same moving air, the same consistent drying. When I built my own tunnel the following spring, I copied Marta's rack design more carefully than any other element of the system. She had made the racks from split pine in 2 thicknesses, heavier longitudinal rails resting on short cross supports, with lighter spacing rails across the top to hold the logs at the correct interval. It was simple joinery. It was exactly correct. She loaded the first logs in the last week of September. Green birch and maple from the ridge felled the same week and carried down the hillside in pairs, maneuvered through the tunnel entrance and positioned on the racks in the order she intended to remove them. Oldest batch nearest the entrance, newest batch furthest in, so that the rotation would work without requiring her to move already drying logs to reach the ones that were ready. The rotation was something Jonas had described and she had built into the design from the beginning. The tunnel would never be emptied completely. New green wood would go in at the back as seasoned wood came out at the front, so that the tunnel always contained wood at multiple stages of drying simultaneously. Not storage with a single cycle, Production: continuous, overlapping, year-round. She loaded 2 cords, closed the entrance door to a narrow gap, not sealed, never sealed. The air needed to move, and opened the vent at the top of the hill. Then she waited. The first 2 weeks of October taught her something about patience that she had not known she needed to learn. She had understood, intellectually, that the seasoning process would not be immediately visible. Jonas had told her the timeline, 4 to 6 weeks for green wood to reach burnable moisture content in a properly functioning tunnel. She had planned for 6 weeks. She had prepared herself for 6 weeks. She had not prepared herself for the particular quality of doubt that fills the space between an action and its confirmation. Every 3 days she opened the entrance door and stepped inside with the lantern. She touched the surface of the nearest log, still damp. She lifted one end. Still heavy. She pressed her thumbnail into the grain and felt the resistance of saturated wood. She closed the door and went back to the cabin and spent the evening doing what she could not stop doing, running Jonas's instructions through her memory again, checking each element of the design against what she had built, looking for the things she might have forgotten or remembered wrong. She found nothing. The design was what he had described. The tunnel was what she had built. The wood would either dry or it would not, and she would not know which for 4 more weeks. On the 15th of October, the first hard frost came overnight. She woke to white ground and the particular clarity of cold air that in Minnesota announces winter's intention as plainly as a formal notice. That morning she did something she had not done before. She went to the tunnel not to examine the wood, but to examine the air. She opened the entrance door and held her lantern near the floor at the opening and watched the flame. It bent inward. The air was moving into the tunnel from outside. Cold outside air flowing in at the base, warmer tunnel air rising and exiting through the vent above. She held the lantern still for a long moment, watching the small, steady lean of the flame that told her the system was working in October cold as Jonas had said it would work. The temperature inside the tunnel, maintained by the insulating mass of 12 feet of earth above and around it, was warmer than the October air outside. The differential had shifted from its summer behavior. The physics had not. She closed the door. She went back to the cabin and made breakfast. By the end of the 3rd week, something changed in the tunnel. The surface of the nearest logs was drier. Not dry, but the passive dampness of saturated wood was receding, replaced by a surface that felt different under her fingertips in a way she could not have described to someone who had not spent 3 weeks touching the same logs every 3 days. The smell had changed as well. The sharp green sap smell of freshly cut birch, the smell that had filled the tunnel since she loaded it, was fading at the edges, replaced by something quieter and warmer underneath it. The smell of wood becoming what it was going to be. She lifted one end of a log, set it down, lifted it again to be certain. It was lighter, not by much, but measurably, verifiably, the log she had carried into the tunnel at the end of September weighed less than it had weighed then. The water was leaving. One invisible layer at a time, the air moving through from entrance to vent was carrying the moisture away, and the wood was becoming wood. She allowed herself nothing more than this observation. She closed the door and walked back to the cabin. She wrote in her household ledger, 3rd week, surface drying, weight reduced, smell changing, continue. It was somewhere in this same week that Reverend Whitmore came. He came alone, which I learned later was deliberate. He had considered organizing a group visit. Several of the women in the congregation had expressed concern about Mrs. Kellner's situation and would have come willingly. But Whitmore was a man who understood the difference between a pastoral call and a committee, and he made it a pastoral call. What had brought him was not, as some people assumed afterward, the absence of a woodpile on Marta's property. He had not noticed that specifically. What he had noticed was her chimney. He told me this himself the winter after the blizzard, when we were sitting in his study, and he was being more honest with me than he needed to be. He said he had driven past her property on a cold morning in late October and looked at the chimney the way he always looked at the chimneys of his parishioners in cold weather, as a practical indicator of how a household was managing. Too much smoke meant wet wood and a struggling fire. No smoke at all meant no fire, which meant a family in serious difficulty. A thin, clean line of smoke meant wood burning as it should. Marta's chimney was producing almost nothing, a trace of heat shimmer above the stone, the suggestion of smoke rather than smoke itself. Whitmore had looked at it for a moment and then looked at the temperature, cold enough that any cabin should be burning steadily, and then driven on. But the image stayed with him. A woman alone, deep autumn, cabin showing almost no sign of fire. Either she was burning nothing, which was alarming, or she was burning something that produced no smoke, which he could not account for, and which alarmed him differently. He knocked on her door on a Wednesday afternoon. She invited him in. The cabin was warm, warmer than he had expected from the chimney's evidence, warm in the settled, even way of a space that has been consistently heated rather than fitfully stoked. The fire in the grate was modest, barely what you would call vigorous, burning on 2 logs that were producing almost no smoke and a great deal of steady orange heat. Whitmore sat down. He accepted the coffee she offered. He looked at the logs in the grate and then at the small stack of wood beside the fireplace. Perhaps 10 logs, pale gold in color, the bark slightly loose in the way of well-seasoned timber, and then around the cabin, and then at the window, beyond which the hillside was visible. He was a perceptive man. He had been a minister on the frontier for 15 years, and he had learned to read a household the way a carpenter reads a structure, looking for the thing that explained everything else. He looked at the fire. He looked at the wood. He looked at the hillside. "Mrs. Kellner," he said, "I want to ask you something directly." "Please," she said, "where is your firewood?" She held her cup in both hands. She considered him for a moment in the way she had of considering people, not sizing them up exactly, but determining what kind of answer would be genuinely useful to them. "I'll show you," she said. She took him around the back of the cabin to the hillside. The tunnel entrance was set into the earth so naturally that a person looking for a woodshed would have walked past it without registering what they were seeing. A timber doorframe fitted into the slope, the frame weathered to nearly the same color as the surrounding soil. The door itself made from the same rough planks as the lining inside. She opened it, handed him the lantern, let him look. He stood at the entrance for a long time without speaking. The logs on the racks were visible in the lantern light, pale and dry, the golden-brown color of timber that has given up its water, stacked with gaps between them in a way that was clearly intentional. The tunnel smelled of dry wood and earth and the faint mineral coolness of the hillside above. He stepped inside. He reached out and touched a log. He pressed it. He looked at the surface his thumb had touched. "This is dry," he said. Not a question. A statement he was making to himself while he absorbed its implications. Yes. This wood has been underground since September, since the last week of September. He turned the log slightly on the rack and looked at its underside. Dry there as well. He looked at the rack itself, the elevation, the spacing, and some understanding of the intentionality of the design moved across his expression. "I've been in storage cellars my entire life," he said. "Underground is damp. This is not damp." "There's a vent at the top of the hill," Marta said. "The air moves through continuously. The wood dries faster than it would outdoors because the temperature never freezes the moisture inside." Whitmore stood in the tunnel. He was not a man who needed to fill silence with speech, which was one of the reasons he was a good minister. He stood and thought and looked at what was in front of him. "Jonas," he said finally, "his father built them in Moravia. His father's father before that. And he taught you." "He talked," Marta said. "I listened." Whitmore looked at her. Then he looked back at the tunnel, at the racks of pale, dry wood sitting in the steady temperature of the Minnesota earth, seasoning themselves with the patience of a system that had been working in the hills of Moravia before either of them was born. "I've buried people," he said quietly, who'd tried things that seemed clever. I know, Marta said. I was at 2 of those burials. He acknowledged this. I would rather have concerns and be wrong about them than be unconcerned and be right. So would Jonas, she said. That's why he explained every step. He wanted to make sure it could be done correctly, if it was ever done. Whitmore handed her back the lantern. He paused at the tunnel entrance, looking at the hillside above where the small vent pipe emerged from the earth. I'll be watching through the winter, he said. You're welcome any time, she said. He left. The afternoon was cold, and the sky to the northwest had the particular flat gray of a sky that has not yet decided what it intends. Marta stood at the tunnel entrance for a moment after he had gone. She looked at the sky in the northwest. Jonas had taught her to read that sky too. She went inside and began preparing for what it was telling her. Miss Velda has stopped writing for a moment. She is looking at her notes, and I can see from here that she has filled 6 pages in a hand that gets smaller as it goes, the way handwriting does when the writer does not want to stop for a fresh page and lose the thread. She looks up. Did she know the blizzard was coming? She asks. She knew something was coming, I say. She had been watching the northwest sky since Whitmore's visit. Jonas had taught her what that particular color of horizon meant in February. February, Miss Veldy says. Not January? The 3rd of February, 1879. I know people sometimes place it earlier in the season, but I have it written down, and I was there. She makes a note of this. I drink my coffee and go back to that morning. The sky on the 2nd of February was the color of a pewter plate left in the cold. Marta was at the tunnel entrance before first light, carrying wood into the cabin in the dark by feel and by the lantern she set on the stump outside. She made 6 trips. The stack inside the cabin reached the height of the windowsill. She looked at it and made 2 more trips, and then stood in the cabin doorway, looking at what she had accumulated, and made a calculation that Jonas had taught her, not in words but in the repeated example of his behavior every autumn, the way he always prepared for more than he thought he needed and was never sorry for it. She made 4 more trips. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped from 18 degrees to 4 above zero. By early afternoon, it had dropped below zero, and the wind had arrived from the northwest with the intent of something that has made a decision and will not be argued with. Snow followed the wind, not falling snow, but driven snow, moving horizontally across the open ground in dense curtains that reduced visibility to the distance between the cabin and the barn. She brought the animals in. She banked the fire carefully with 2 of the seasoned logs and watched it settle into a steady, even burn that she calculated would hold through the night without requiring attention. Then she sat down at the table and listened to the wind work on the cabin and felt the warmth of the fire against her back, and thought about Jonas, which she did not always allow herself to do, but which sometimes could not be helped. I will tell you what the storm was like from my side of it, because I think it is useful to have both. I was not in difficulty. I had purchased 3 cords from Brant's yard in November, and it was decent wood, better seasoned than most of what he sold, and I had enough to manage. My cabin was cold on the worst nights, 38 degrees by the 3rd morning, with the fire burning constantly, but cold in a manageable way, the way that requires another blanket and a hat worn indoors, but does not threaten anything beyond discomfort. What was not manageable was the situation at the Schreiber property. I learned about it on day 3 from a man named Pedersen, who had tried to check on them and turned back in the wind. Hildegard Schreiber had 6 children and a husband who had been ill since October, and a woodpile that had been adequate for a normal winter. This was not a normal winter. She had been burning her supply at double the planned rate because the wood, cut in November and stacked outdoors through December, was poorly seasoned and producing half the heat it should have. Her cabin was at 40 degrees by day 3 and dropping. I want to say something about Hildegard Schreiber before I continue, because this story tends to become about the people at the center of it, and she was at the edges And she deserves more than that. She had done everything correctly. She had planned. She had prepared. She was a careful, competent woman, managing an extremely difficult situation without complaint. And she was losing that situation not because she had been careless, but because the standard method for preparing winter fuel in southern Minnesota was not adequate for this particular winter. That is the thing I have always wanted people to understand when they hear this story. The problem was not the Schreibers. The problem was a system that failed capable people as readily as it failed careless ones. On the morning of day 4, Astrid Halverson put on every layer of clothing she owned and walked to Marta Kellner's cabin. She did not go to Whitmore. She did not go to Brant. She went to Marta because she had watched Marta for 5 months, and she trusted what she had seen, which was a woman who did not take action she had not thought through completely and did not fail at things she had committed to. She knocked. Marta opened the door. Astrid came inside. "The Schreiber children," Astrid said. 6 of them. Hildegard's fire won't hold. The youngest has stopped complaining." Marta was already moving toward her coat. She did not make a speech. She did not say, "Take what you need," or anything of that kind. She put on her coat and her boots and her heavy mittens, and she went outside and opened the tunnel door, and she began loading the sledge. I arrived at her property sometime in the late morning of day 4, having heard from 3 separate people that Marta Kellner's cabin was reportedly 60-some degrees while the Schreiber cabin was approaching the lower boundary of survivable temperature. I walked 2 miles in knee-deep snow and -20 wind because I am a carpenter and I could not make sense of what I was being told, and I needed to make sense of it. She was at the tunnel when I arrived. The sledge was already loaded, a full cord of logs pale gold in the gray winter light, stacked with a neatness that seemed incongruous in the middle of a blizzard. She was adding to it. I looked at the logs on the sledge. I looked at the logs on the rack inside the tunnel. Then I looked at Marta. She did not seem surprised to see me. She handed me the rope of the sledge. "Schreiber Farm," she said. "Astrid knows the way." I looked at the logs again. I reached out and picked one up, a maple log, 18 inches long, perhaps 4 inches through. The weight was wrong. It was too light. Green wood has a particular heaviness that comes from water in the fiber, and this log had none of it. I turned it in my hands. The color was the pale gold brown of wood that has given up its moisture, the bark slightly loose at the ends. I knocked on it with my knuckle. The sound was hollow. I knocked again because I did not trust what I had heard the first time. Hollow. The clear, resonant sound of properly seasoned timber. The sound that tells a carpenter, before any other test, that the wood in his hand is ready to be used. I had been making that knock for 35 years. I had never heard it from wood that had been underground since September. "How?" I said. It was not a question, exactly. It was the sound a man makes when his framework encounters something it cannot account for. She explained the system. She explained it the way she explained most things, without preamble, without apology, without any apparent need for me to be impressed by it. The slope, the temperature differential, the airflow from entrance to vent, the constant underground temperature that prevented freeze damage to the wood fibers, the racks, the rotation, the 6-week timeline. She explained it while continuing to load the sledge. When she finished, I stood in the tunnel entrance for a moment with my knuckles still tingling from the knock test, and thought about Jonas Kellner at Gerhardt's store counter, talking about trees in the way that some men talk about horses. I thought about the envelope drawing in her household ledger, the cross-section in check measurements that I had not understood when I saw it. I thought about the woman measuring planks in her yard in October while I drove past on the wagon road and assumed she was fixing the barn. "Jonas," I said. "His father built them," she said. "His father's father before that." I pulled the sledge. The wood burned like a different substance. I watched Hildegard feed the first log into the Schreiber fireplace, and within 10 minutes, the temperature in that cabin had risen 5 degrees. Within an hour, it had risen 15. The fire was not consuming itself in steam and smoke the way Green wood does. It was burning clean and hot with the steady orange efficiency of fuel that is simply doing what fuel is supposed to do. Hildegard stood in front of it with her youngest child and did not say anything for a long time. By day 5, 7 families had sent someone through the blizzard to Marta's tunnel. By day 6, 2 more. Each person who entered the tunnel had a version of the same experience I had had. The disbelief, the touch, the knock, the slow revision of what they understood to be possible. Each person left carrying wood that heated their cabin in a way their own wood had stopped being able to do. Whitmore came on day 7. He came alone. No delegation, no organized visit. He came in the morning, and Marta took him to the tunnel, and he stood inside it for a longer time than I had stood inside it on day 4. He looked at the racks. He looked at the ceiling construction. He reached up and pressed his palm against one of the ceiling planks and felt the clay packing between the beams. Then he looked at the vent shaft in the back wall of the tunnel, the small square opening, timber-lined, rising up through the hillside to the surface above, and he was quiet for a while. "I've been watching your chimney since October," he said. "I know," Marta said. "I saw you drive past." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was not quite the expression of a man who has been wrong, because Whitmore was too honest with himself to make his being wrong into a simple story. It was more the expression of a man who is integrating new information into a framework that it does not fit without alteration. "The prayer I said for you," he said. "In the autumn, I asked that you would find a way to stay warm." "I heard about it," Marta said. "I was grateful." "It appears the answer to that prayer was arranged in Moravia," he said slowly, "some decades before I thought to ask." He did not apologize. I have always thought that was right. An apology would have made the moment about him, and it was not about him. He took 2 armloads of wood when he left, and the following Sunday he said something from the pulpit about wisdom that arrives in forms we do not recognize, and everyone in the congregation understood what he meant without requiring him to explain it. The storm ended on the morning of February 11th, 8 days, minus 28 degrees at the coldest. I know these figures because I wrote them in my ledger, the same ledger I used for building commissions and materials estimates, and the notes on construction techniques that I had been accumulating since 1869. I wrote down the temperature each day of the blizzard the way I would record the dimensions of a building I was about to work on. Because I was a carpenter, and I recorded things, and because some part of me already understood that what had happened during those 8 days was something I would want to have accurately recorded. The morning after the storm, I walked back to Marta's property. The snow was still and blue-white in the early light, and the sky was the particular clear color that follows a hard storm in Minnesota, a color that seems to apologize for nothing and explain nothing, but simply presents itself as the sky that is available now that the other sky has finished. The vent pipe was sticking up from the hillside above the tunnel, 8 inches of timber pipe with a small cap, barely visible above the snow. That was all you could see of the system from outside. A pipe in the snow, 18 feet of lined tunnel, 2 cords of drying wood on their racks, a drainage channel, a door set into earth, and from the outside, a pipe. I stood and looked at it for a long time. I have thought often since then about what I was thinking during that time, and the honest answer is that I was thinking about all the things I had driven past without understanding what I was looking at. Miss Velde has set down her pencil. She is looking at me with the expression of a reporter who has come for one kind of story and received another kind, and is in the process of determining whether the kind she received is better. I reach into the inside pocket of my coat and set something on the table between us. It is my carpenter's ledger from 1879. The cover is worn to the color of old saddle leather, and the binding has been repaired twice with linen thread. I open it to the place I have kept marked for 32 years, a section in the back, after the commission records and the materials estimates and the notes on joinery techniques, where the handwriting changes character. The pages here are filled with drawings, cross-sections, plan views, dimensions in both feet, and the old Moravian units that I had to ask Marta to convert for me. Notes on timber specifications and rack construction and drainage channel dimensions and vent shaft placement. A list of questions I had asked her and the answers she had given, written down while they were still fresh. At the top of the first page I had written, in the winter of 1879, in the careful hand I used for technical records, Kellner Tunnel System, Mankato Township, specifications as described by M. Kellner, February 1879. I built my own tunnel that spring, using these specifications. I built 2 more for other properties in the county over the following 3 years. Each one I built, I consulted these pages. Each one worked exactly as the specification said it would. I pushed the ledger across the table toward Miss Veld. Jonas Kellner was a forest warden from Moravia, I say, who spent the last years of his life working in a sawmill. His wife was a woman who made dinner and listened. Those are the plain facts of who they were. I don't know that there is much more to add to that, except this. I tap the ledger. Tap. Everything in this system, the tunnel angle, the rack design, the vent placement, the drainage, I copied from what Marta built on that hillside. I am a carpenter with 35 years of experience, and I copied it because it was right, because it worked, because a woman who had never built anything like it built it correctly on her first attempt, alone, from memory, in 4 weeks. Miss Veld is writing again. She died in 1903, I say. I went back to the tunnel in 1905 with her daughter's permission. The timber lining was sound, the vent was drawing air. If you put green wood in it today, it would be seasoned in 6 weeks. I take the ledger back, close it, return it to my pocket. Outside, the boy is still fishing. He has not caught anything and likely will not. The river is cold and the season is early and the odds are against him. He does not appear to have considered this. That's the story, I say to Miss Veld. She looks at what she has written. 6.5 pages in a hand that started large and finished small. I'll make sure her name is in the headline, she says. I think about this for a moment. Put Jonas in it too, I say. He talked for 17 years. It seems fair to give him a line.